events that we have launched before the adoption 2 years ago of a historic resolution at the United Nations Environment Assembly, setting up the path to a global treaty to end plastic pollution. This series of dialogues making links with ongoing multilateral processes to tackle plastic pollution in Geneva and beyond is organized by the Geneva Environment Network in collaboration with the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Convention Secretariat, the Center for International Environmental Law, the Global Governance Center at the Graduate Institute, IUCN, the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs, the University of Geneva, and the governments of Norway and Switzerland. As you know, the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee to develop the international legally binding instrument that was set up following the adoption of the resolution will meet for its 5th session at the end of next month in Busan, in the Republic of Korea. The Road to Busan event series, organized as part of the Geneva with Plastic Pollution Dialogues and in collaboration with various partners that we started in June, provides member states and stakeholders a platform to prepare for the upcoming negotiation by launching new reports and initiatives and hosting briefings and discussion for a timely outcome of this very important negotiation. We have partnered with the International Institute for Sustainable Development Earth Negotiations Bulletin to organize the event that you are attending today. And we are adopting a new format. We are indeed delighted to be joined today by the chair of this process, His Excellency Ambassador Luis Vallas of Ecuador, who will soon kick off our line up of leading speakers. They were invited to provide a variety of perspectives, passing the baton from one stakeholder to another on what's needed in the treaty as essential to fulfill the objective to end plastic pollution. So there's no moderation. Every speaker will be introducing the next speaker. Before we begin, let me remind you that the documents presented, the summary, as well as the video of the event will be made available as usual on the webpage of this event. And throughout the event, you can raise questions by using the Q&A box, where our guests will try to answer. You can see also here on the slide how you can access that box. And the transcript is also available in over 100 languages, as indicated in the next slide. So with that, Excellency Ambassador Luis Vallas, you now have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice to see you all. Good afternoon, good morning with some of you, and good evening with others. Very nice to be here, and thank you very much to the Geneva Environment Network for organizing this webinar, which is quite important in a crucial moment. Preparing our work and our path, like you said, towards Busan, towards our INC 5. But before I go into INC 5 organizational work and ideas of how we are going to negotiate in Busan, I want to recall the achievements that we got in INC 4. For INC 4 that we had in Ottawa, in Canada, in April this year, well, we did work hard. Of course, we prepared before INC 4 our organization and so on and so forth. And we achieved and we took very important decisions. One of those decisions was to establish the legal drafting group that we established in INC 4 and will start working in INC 5. Another very important decision was to have formal intersessional work, and we had expert groups, 2 expert groups meeting in Bangkok some months ago. Very important and very also productive and constructive meeting. And also, and very important too, we start textual negotiations. We start negotiating on text in the different contact groups and subgroups during our meeting in Canada. And product of those negotiations is what we have now as an official document, the compiled text, also as a decision that we took in INC 4. But to tell you that in my consultations with the regions, with the Bureau, with all members, we see that it will be very, very difficult, if not to say impossible, but very difficult to start our negotiations in Busan with that text, with the compiled text. Because of that, I have come with a proposal on process, yes, but also with a proposal of from what of what we are going to negotiate in Busan. And my proposal was to work with the heads of delegations, with the negotiators, with the experts that have been participating from day one in this process. And I have proposed to identify specific elements that will help us to negotiate in Busan, but to get to the end of INC 5 with an effective international legally binding instrument that will give us credible rules to end plastic pollution, and that will be also effective in its implementation. So I have proposed this identification of some elements that we could discuss, negotiate, and agreed in Busan. And I prepared a non-paper that I presented to the heads of delegation. And that non-paper was discussed in a meeting that we had at the middle of last month, the middle of September, the 16th of September. We had a very important informal virtual meeting with the HOTS, with heads of delegations from the members. And after that heads of delegation meeting, virtual meeting, also I prepared an iteration of that non-paper, a second non-paper that I present with more substance, with more details on those elements, and I present to the members, and we also use that document as starting point of our discussions of our work in a meeting that we had in person, informal meeting in person with the heads of delegations this week, at the beginning of this week in Nairobi. Monday and Tuesday this week, we met in Nairobi with heads of delegations also to have this exchange of views based, yes, in the non-paper that I have prepared for them, but also looking for common understanding, a space of negotiation, room of negotiation also that we could have in Busan. And I can tell you that I'm quite positive. Of course, we need a lot of work. Of course, there is still some divergences, but I'm positive seeing what I saw also in Nairobi. We still, as I said, a lot of work. We need to build bridges in some of the elements, yes, but also the moment when members, and I thank so much our heads of delegations from all the countries, because we could hear again, positions, views that we have heard maybe more than once before, but that also gave them and gave us the opportunity to see spaces, to see room for negotiation in Busan, with those, especially with those contagious or more complex elements that we know that there is in any negotiation. Any negotiation has situations like we are facing that, of course, we need to work hard. Yes, we need to find this common understanding. Yes, and I can tell you that we are seeing that after what we saw in Nairobi this week. As I said, it was a very positive exchange of views, seeing also these spaces for negotiation. This was an informal setting, informal meeting of heads of delegation. It was not a negotiation. Negotiation we will have in the Republic of Korea, but again, it gave us a lot of light of how those negotiations could take place in Busan in INC 5, where we are going to have our final round of negotiations, and we are going to go to the end of INC 5 with an effective, robust text. Also, I would like to add that product of those exchange of views in Nairobi this week, we are working on the organization of work. So how we are going to have our negotiation groups. And I will I will release a scenario note at the middle of this month. Around the 14th, 15th of October, we will send the scenario note also with organization of work. And very important product of those discussions in Nairobi. Also, I could feel members, and they have expressed that, agree in the process that I have proposed. Process-wise, we all understand that we need to identify those elements for negotiation in Busan, but also very important that I receive the trust from members also to prepare a third non-paper, a third document, iteration of what we have had before, including with text. So that's quite important. I'm working on that. I've been working right after Nairobi from Wednesday on this next document that I will present. And we will also keep having consultations, meetings with the members to work in this informal intersessional period. And then once we get to Busan, of course, we need to formalize our work that we have carried out in this informal period. Because one thing was the formal intersessional work that we had in Bangkok with the expert groups. That was a formal intersessional work, but also we've been carrying out also this informal intersessional work with heads of delegations, with the non-papers that I have said, and also preparing a constructive, because that's what we are looking for, a constructive, effective negotiation in Busan. I want to take this opportunity also to thank the members of the Bureau that I am working with them. I meet regularly with the Bureau members, also to keep working in that organizational work, and also I thank them very much for their support. We have to remember that we have only 7 weeks until we start our negotiations in Busan, that it will be 7 days. And those 7 days means 63 hours of work that we need to work in a very, very constructive, efficient, and effective way. Because I tell you, and I feel when I had this meeting in Nairobi, and I have felt before also the commitment of the members and also of stakeholders, that we are in the same side. We are in the same side to combat and to end plastic pollution. And I thank you very much for that. And I thank you very much also to participate in this webinar. Thank you. And I have to give the floor to the next speaker, right? And that will be David Asulay, right? Am I correct? Yes, thank you. So, David, please, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, Luis, and thank you very much, both for outlining the rest of the process and to Jen for organizing this webinar. I don't have that much time, so I'm going to try to drill down to the fundamentals of the civil society and rights holders' views. First of all, production controls are essential to the successful addressing of the plastic crisis. They are an enabler of all and any measures adopted in the future treaty, and they also make economic sense when the world is now facing a production glut for some of the core polymer, a situation of production facilities operating at historically low rate and below profitability in most of the world. And so without effective measures to limit the current production rate and expected growth, this treaty will fail to make a dent in our plastic crisis. Simple as that. This is not radical thinking. This is clearly established scientific fact. Of course, there are some details that need to be worked out and numbers to be further crunched to make it fair for all, but without clear obligation and processes to get there, we will fail. Ignoring this or pretending otherwise is not being realistic, as I sometimes hear. It's being delusional and fundamentally dishonest. Second, plastic are a mismatch of toxic material, approximately 16,000 substances according to peer-reviewed scientific literature. And if we want to continue producing some plastic, and I think we all do, we have to detoxify the whole plastic supply chain. Human health impacts and environmental impacts are real. They're massive. They happen at every stage of the life cycle and make any idea of circularity a factual impossibility. Without effective measures to phase out the problematic and toxic chemicals globally, the only circularity we can have is a circularity of harm, and that's not what we want. Again, this is not dogmatic radical thinking. This is established scientific facts. Everybody understands that we will not achieve anything without a functional and likely innovative funding mechanism. Progress were made during the recent discussion in Bangkok, but we need to face the fact that the just transition to an economy that respects human health and human rights will require the mobilization of finances to an extent that cannot be covered only by the business as usual ways of mobilizing finances. Official Development Assistance, ODA, will be key, and so will be setting up fair and equitable mechanism to collect, disperse, and allocate these funds. But we also know that it is unlikely to be enough. In this regard, innovative ideas such as production fees should be approached constructively rather than with dogmatic resistance to anything new and different. It should also be acknowledged, and that's very important, that financial mechanisms in the treaty need to be connected to actual obligation. We know from past experiences that creating merely incentives or voluntary approaches makes it all but impossible to mobilize adequate financial resources. And building on this, we do need to learn what we've done before, as well as remember why we're in this negotiation in the first place. Because the problem is global. No countries can solve this on their own or free ride its way through this crisis. We need global answers that create a global playing field, not just declaration of intent, leaving every country to adopt their own measures, such as their own list of problematic chemicals to be phased out. This would be bad for trade, bad for business, and experience clearly shows that it would be largely useless. Of course, we should create some flexibility to take into consideration national circumstances, but that can be done and has been done successfully in previous MEAs without compromising on the global and legally binding nature of the obligations. We can spin things however we want, but history is very clear. When we put in place legally binding obligations and clear and fair roadmaps for all, such as in the Montreal Protocol, we successfully get together, create effective collaboration, and solve problems. When we merely set directions, identify incentives and voluntary measures, and leave it to each country to invent solutions on their own, such as in the Paris Agreement, we create unfair competition, race to the bottom, and we dramatically fail. So we'll add two final points, one on transparency and participation, and one on timing and sequencing. Contrary to what seems to have been some of the decision over the past few months, there can be no successful negotiation without active and effective involvement and engagement of all. And in particular, those whose life have been driven by the plastic age, whether they chose to dedicate their time and energy to become researchers, such as Bethany, who will be speaking in a few seconds, or whether they had no choice, as they grew up in the shadows of petrochemical production facilities, landfills, or incinerators, or have had to change their ways of life because their traditional livelihood was made impossible because of plastic pollution. So let's make sure the coming months are open and inclusive, and we can work all together to meet one of the greatest challenges of our time. And finally, I'm going to respond or address one of the things that was also raised by Ambassador Vallas just before me. We all know the problem is urgent, and we all know that we need to get started sooner rather than later. But you don't build a solid house by hurrying and neglecting the foundation. Just ask the two of the three famous little peaks, if you know the story. If we don't take the time to build a solid foundation for action, we can add as much straw as we want to the walls later. It will prove useless. And in this regard, I think Ambassador Vallas' non-paper has a lot of value in identifying what needs to be decided now and what can be discussed and finalized at a later stage. But let's be clear. The COP will not be able to adopt any decision that would fundamentally alter the rights and obligation of the parties. So we need the obligations to be clearly established in the treaty itself. We started these negotiations inspired by a sense of responsibility and hope that addressing the plastic crisis, ending plastic pollution, upholding the rights of future generations to live in a clean and healthy environment was not only possible, but achievable through international cooperation and inclusiveness. So let us embrace this UNEA 5.2 spirit, the one that led to the mandate, and not compromise this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity in the name of false realisticness or artificial time crunch, because that would really be letting down the generation that come in front of us. So thank you very much again for the invitation. I'm now passing the mic to Bethany Carney-Almroth, who will be speaking on behalf of the Scientist Coalition.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for the invitation to speak here. I'm a scientist in Sweden at the University of Gothenburg, working in ecotoxicology and environmental sciences, and I'm here on behalf of the Scientist Coalition for an Effective Plastics Treaty. We are Close to 400 academic scientists, or mostly academic scientists, working in plastics across different fields of expertise, and we are in 60 different countries, so we have a very broad coverage. I will be speaking from a scientific perspective, and as you heard from David, our previous speaker, many of his comments and interventions were based in science, so there will be a bit of repetition, which is a good thing, because that means that we're on the right path, according to what the science is telling us. And we can use science to understand the problem of plastics. The scale of the problem, which you heard just recently, is global. We define plastics pollution, or the plastics life cycle, as starting with resource extraction and production of monomers and polymers, moving into product manufacturing, transportation and trade, into the use phase, which includes commercial and industrial and consumer use, then into waste management or mismanagement, potentially recycling, all the way through to the global pollution that we're seeing today and the need for remediation in a lot of environments. And we also understand that plastics pollution and emissions are occurring throughout this entire life cycle, starting at its extraction and production phase. And we see emissions of chemicals, including monomers and polymers, of EDCs, of metals, of different chemicals that are used in the production of plastics or in the products themselves. We see emission of micro nanoparticles, of greenhouse gases, of larger macroplastics and littered products. And we can sort of trace their emissions and their fate as they're moving through our ecosystems. Science also helps us understand the harm that is caused by all of these emissions in the environment, in climate, in human health, in human rights, and in the economy. We can place plastics pollution at the center of the triple planetary crisis, which has been identified by the UN, identifying the three major threats that we face as a human society on the planet right now, and that is climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And science helps us understand the mechanisms for how plastics is driving each of these crises, and also how these crises are interconnected. We also know that right now, plastics production is currently beyond what the planet can tolerate. We see disruptions in Earth systems functions. We know that plastics pollution is beyond what our societies and what human health can tolerate. So there are threats to all three pillars of sustainability: and environmental, social, and economic sustainability. And we also know that these problems cannot be addressed by focusing on waste management. Rather, we need to look at the entire life cycle, starting with production. And we can use all of the science that I've just very briefly touched on to help us understand the problems, and then therefore a path forward. So given what we understand about plastics and problems, we identified a number of key elements that should be included in the treaty in order for it to be effective in achieving the goal of ending plastics pollution. The first is ambitious and legally binding global and national reduction targets and incentives to reduce primary plastic production. So all the way at the start of the plastics life cycle, at the very first step, at the top of the waste hierarchy. And all of the scientific studies that have been done and all the modeling efforts that have been done say that we need to include production reduction in order to achieve our goals. And this is including a very recent report that was released by the OECD earlier this week. You also heard mention of chemicals, which David mentioned. There was a recent report on 16,000 chemicals that are used and present in the production of plastics and plastics products, which brings me to our second point, which is globally mandated regulatory provisions for the thousands of hazardous chemicals found in plastics. Of those 16,000, 4,200 have hazardous properties, 10,000 are lacking data. The majority of plastics chemicals are unregulated. The BRS released a report saying that 1% are currently regulated globally. So we're calling for a hazard-based approach to do this, which would be the most predictive and easiest, most effective way to regulate chemicals, and for applying grouping and listings of chemicals in the treaty itself. Then we're also asking in a third point for global and national phase outs of plastics, chemicals, polymers, and products that are non-essential. So here I'm not only talking about single-use products, which maybe are the ones that are most commonly addressed as non-essential, but also the chemicals and the polymers that are used to make the products that we're talking about. So again, moving upstream to production and product design. And we would need to determine whether the plastics, chemicals, polymers, and products are critical for the health, safety, and functioning of society, and whether there exists acceptable alternatives using an environmental and health standpoints to inform those decisions. Our fourth requirement, or something that we would see as critical in the treaty, would be transparency criteria and mandatory monitoring and reporting of the obligations throughout the entire supply chain. This would be critical for providing data and helping us to inform reduction, simplification of plastics and numbers and types of chemicals and products that are on the market, the services and alternatives and substitutes that we might be bringing into the market. We would need to have a development of harmonized standards and compliance mechanisms and enforcement mechanisms for these transparency and reporting obligations, but they would help us understand the effectiveness of treaty obligations that maybe would need to be addressed and changed over time. Our fifth point would be including micro and nanoplastics, and this would be going beyond microplastics as additives in products, but rather, given our understanding of plastics pollution globally and the fact that a third of plastics pollution is contributed to micro and nanoplastics, we need to have mechanisms for preventing their formation and their release into the environment, and also knowing that these cannot be effectively removed from the environment once they're out there. Financial mechanisms will be important, of course. I won't develop further on that in the interest of time, and we already heard some comments on that from David. But finally, I would like to end on the point around a science body that should be mandated by the treaty and would be critical in guiding the treaty as it goes forward into the future. We would emphasize the need for ensuring that the targets remain scientifically informed and adaptive over time as our systems change, as our science changes and evolves, and that this body of this scientific body should be composed of scientists and other plastics pollution experts who are free of financial or other vested conflicts of interests. And with that, I'll end. I will be happy to discuss more when we have questions. And I will pass on to our next speaker, who is Robert Hardy, political advisor at the Department of Environmental, Food and Rural Affairs in the UK. It's all yours.
Thanks, Bethany. And yes, I'm Robert Hardy. I'm the INC focal point for the United Kingdom and part of our negotiating team. I've been invited to give some perspectives on some of the key points that we need to align on in the new treaty. We are indeed approaching the finishing line, and here in the UK, we're in the middle of our final preparations for INC 5 and that final push towards Busan. Something I think we can all align on is the need for some rest after INC 5 and 2 years of hard work and negotiations. But some of the key points that we do really need to align on is the need for action sooner rather than later. I think all INC members are united in their desire to get an agreement at INC 5, and that's because we know that the current policy trajectory is simply unsustainable, and that we need to address urgent action. We need urgent action, to address the problem of plastic pollution, and that should involve promoting the sustainable production and consumption of primary plastic polymers. We know from the recent OECD report that Bethany mentioned that their production and use will increase by almost 70% by 2040, and that waste management capacity will simply not keep pace with the generation of waste, and that will lead to an increase of 50% of mismanaged plastic waste, and a further increase of 50% of that waste leaking to the environment, which we know can have devastating impacts on the environment, ecosystems, people, the economy, and the climate. The contribution of plastics towards the climate crisis will continue to increase and take up a greater share of global greenhouse gas emissions, and will reach almost 5% of the total global share of greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. So the second thing I think we need to align on is the need for a treaty that is effective, implementable, credible, fit for purpose, and is actually capable of achieving the goal of ending plastic pollution. We know from the evidence base that only global action across the full life cycle of plastic can actually end plastic pollution. And that point of ending plastic pollution, that is the title of the UNEA resolution, and that should be the guiding star of the INC to get an agreement that is actually capable of addressing the full life cycle of plastic and can end plastic pollution. Evidence shows, as mentioned by Bethany, that downstream measures do improve global waste management. They do reduce the amount of waste that's produced and leaking to the environment, but they don't go far enough. Only globally coordinated action with common global rules that address the full life cycle of plastic can actually end plastic pollution. That should include reducing the production and consumption of primary plastic polymers to a sustainable level, phasing out and restricting problematic and avoidable products, and designing products to be circular from their inception. dealing with plastic pollution is much more manageable if you address its key drivers. And it's imperative that we look at the full picture. These measures, alongside waste management practices that are improved and improved capacity, can virtually end plastic pollution. So it's clear that we need a treaty that has both upstream, midstream and downstream measures to be effective. The third point that I think we can align on is the need to mobilise support for implementation of the treaty's objectives. A high ambition treaty that addresses the full life cycle of plastics only has modest costs for big environmental benefits and would actually cost less than downstream actions. We know that this is because the largest costs that could result from the treaty are to do with collecting and sorting of waste. And if we don't address the flow of waste that is created, the costs will grow and grow. It's important to acknowledge that the costs are unevenly distributed. Sub-Saharan African countries will face the largest costs, but for most countries, reducing the volumes of waste does offset the overall costs for most countries. We do need to mobilise support from the widest possible variety of sources to close the funding gap that was mentioned by David, estimated at between $350 and $500 billion, and target that support to where it is most needed. Plastic pollution is a broad issue that impacts all of society, a broad range of actors across the life cycle in society. Therefore, we do need an equally broad mobilisation of resources from a diverse range of sources, including financial architecture that is in accordance with the polluter pays principle. As I mentioned, we know that some countries face bigger challenges than others, and not just sub-Saharan African countries, but least developed countries and small island developing states are disproportionately impacted. There is that finite amount of international public finance that is available to support implementation, and something that is imperative that we have in the treaty is a mechanism that is able to target that support effectively to where it is most needed, so it can be efficient as possible. The treaty does also bring with it some opportunities. We're going to hear soon from some business coalition members, but we know that setting a clear policy trajectory in the treaty with common global rules, harmonised taxonomies that give certainty to business, financial actors can incentivise and enable them to invest in the circular economy for plastics. And that certainty, alongside ODA, public-private partnerships and blended finance initiatives, can de-risk investment and fund the transition towards a circular economy. I believe that I'm now to pass over to Mohammed from Jordan, who's with you in Geneva. Thank you very much.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Geneva Network for hosting this meeting and inviting me to be a panelist in this very important and timely webinar, The Way to the Busan. I don't know whether maybe a lot of you, they know that I was part of the bureau of INC until the beginning of this week, and because I am retiring, and that's why the Asia Pacific region will replace me maybe during this way to Busan or in Busan. And why I am here in Geneva, because now I am freelance, and I was invited by WHO to attend one of the important workshops, which is called the Climate Resilient and Environmental Sustainable Supply Chain into the Health Sector. And frankly speaking, my career with the Ministry of Environment around 30 years. And first time I was invited by WHO in such event. And I was surprised that a lot of effort WHO doing what they are doing in terms of environment, in terms of reduction of releases, and big amount from the releases, it comes from healthcare sector, and from health sector, which is around 7% from the global releases of CO2, it's come from a supply chain, and 30% is from plastic. And it was a lot of studies, and the presenter, they are confirming that plastic, it is a lot of plastic is bad things, and as Batty said, and from the scientist point of view, and it was, I hear this from Batty during the INC1 in Uruguay, but in this week I am heard from the WHO that it is very bad to have this chemicals in plastic, and it's impacted directly the human health. And I raise a question: why, if you are confirming as scientists and international governmental body as WHO, why you are not impacting very much the process of INC to have very balanced, very strong convention on plastic pollution? And I didn't, frankly speaking, hear a strong answer, but I was also, by the way, this workshop attended by the high level, a lot of directors from WHO was attended, and the deputy of the general director of WHO also. And I raised this question: we need to link this and your work with the environmental. And they told that WHO is driven by ministers of health. And I ask open question: why ministers of health, if you, the umbrella organization, global umbrella like WHO, is saying that plastic is bad things and it's impacted the human health plus the environment? The environment is a lot of people they are talking about, but in my intervention, I need to link between the health sector and health impact of plastic and environmental impact. And why WHO not engaging more the ministers of health, that who is driving the work of WHO in the negotiation itself? Who is negotiating the convention if we see that almost or a lot of delegation, Ministry of Environment from over all the world, who is negotiating the plastic treaty? But the plastic is affecting not only environment and directly impacting the human health. And I ask question: why ministers of health doesn't impacting or supporting the delegation from ministries of environment in the negotiation? Why are other ministries like ministries of trade and industries and energy, sometimes they are leading the negotiation even for some countries, and we didn't hear any voice from the ministries of health? It is maybe some, but it is not enough. I think we trust the WHO outcome studies that they are confirming, and their studies, it is based on the science. And everybody from us is believe that scientists and science should drive our process. We are not against plastic. We are against plastic pollution. This is the main message that I would like to be like umbrella on the final step of negotiation. Now we are approaching the end of the INC process. We are like inverted pyramid. We are of the neck now of pyramid, and we need to finalize to have a good balanced convention that covered all the life cycle or supply chain of plastic, starting from primary plastic and the hazardous chemicals. We need to have very strong articles that dealing with the hazardous chemicals, because it is impacting all the rest of the life cycle of the plastic. We need to describe and tackle the eco-design, how we are designing products, what kind of chemicals it's allowed to have or what not. And it is impacted, of course, the rest of the life cycle, like circularity and etc. And also the production itself, which is we are producing this plastic according to the environmental sound manner or not. And then starting after using this plastic, the life cycle of waste, where we are introducing a new system like EPR. And here we need to highlight some social and economical aspect. When we are talking about EPR, we are talking about new investment opportunities, including another jobs, new jobs, green jobs, and also enhancing the circularity that also, it is one of the SDGs is talking about sustainable production and consumption. All these things we need to keep in mind when we are going to the final stage of negotiation. To summarize, I would like maybe to who is hearing me that the ministries of health should be engaged more in the process of negotiation, and they should support the ministries of environment. Everybody knows, scientists knows, we are confirming, we are respecting to the science that plastic pollution, it is not good for our health and for our environment. The ministries do, key ministries of environment and health should support each other in the final stage of negotiation. Thank you very much. Now I turn over to Albert Maglan, Chief Environmental Management Specialist, Climate Change Service, Central Office, Philippines. Please.
So much, Mohammed, from the Philippines. A pleasant evening to all. So first and foremost, I'd like to thank the organizers of this dialogue, and it's a good opportunity for member state like the Philippines to share its views on how to put forward the position of member states, especially the developing countries, while working on our road to Busan. And also, from the point of view of my member state, I would like to share some key points on how to align with the new multilateral environmental agreement. So perhaps I would like to take off from what the takeaways that we had from the intersessional work. So there was an opportunity for member states to work on the conference room papers in a roundtable discussion, wherein a general approach for addressing problematic plastic products, chemicals of concern, and product design was presented, as already discussed by the speakers before me. So the results of this roundtable discussions provided a way forward towards consolidating the conference room papers into one uniform, hopefully, a uniform proposal to be presented for endorsement by other member states. So from the Philippines point of view, the proposal to consolidate the multiple CRPs would entail three-step process, such as number one, there should be the identification of problematic products by a dedicated committee based on a science-based criteria agreed by parties. Second, there should be assessment by a dedicated committee of possible control measures and possible exemptions. And lastly, there should be a decision by the conference of the parties on the recommendations for inclusion in a periodically reviewed annex. So I have mentioned about product design as one of those elements that were presented in the CRPs. At this point in time, I'd like to present some key priorities. The product design is a key priority for the treaty text, and also the product design is a key element on which negotiations need to focus most on in order to achieve convergence. As we all know, product design is an important aspect contributing to plastic pollution, and also important attributes of product design should reflect the waste hierarchy and include resource efficiency, material simplicity, safety, and sustainability. This will also include durability, reusability, and as we often discuss, refillability and refurbishability. And of course, the consideration of safe circularity, addressing the chemicals of concern. So some sectors such as packaging, textiles, and even agricultural plastics could be prioritized. So specific design requirements for selected products or groups of products could be developed. So there are various approaches that would include globally harmonized guidelines, global mandatory standards, global design, and also coupled that wherein national standards should also be take into consideration. Transparency, as mentioned by speakers before earlier, transparency, traceability, and even labeling, and most of all, reporting are important. So global standards should be accessible and developed transparently with broad stakeholder participation. So based on the discussion, there were points of contention that we have observed. Like, although there was a general agreement on the need to address product design, there were also differences on whether approaches should be voluntary, mandatory, or a combination of both. So, and also whether they should be global, national, or a combination of both. So some saw a benefit in integrating problematic plastic products, chemicals of concern, and product design, while others preferred that they be kept separate. So several member states, as we have observed, opposed approaches that resulted in a reduction of primary plastic polymers, while others supported reduction through resource efficiency and material simplicity. Okay, given all these points of contentions, uh, now we are looking or anticipating for the global treaty um, that should contain provisions for product design, which could entail a combination of globally harmonized design criteria and global design requirements for specific sectors or product groups, coupled with national standards, of course. So the criteria should be reflect should reflect the waste hierarchy and also include resource efficiency, material simplicity, safety, durability, and so on. So the core elements should also include transparency, labeling, and reporting, as well as equity principle of common but differentiated responsibility, taking into account national circumstances and capabilities. So I would also like to talk about the options, or as I've read in the program, the options and appetite for addressing upstream parts of the plastic life cycle. In several sessions, the Philippines supported the global aggregate reduction in primary plastic polymer as already stipulated in UNEA 5/14 resolution that promotes sustainable production and consumption of plastics through upstream measures that can effectively reduce the projected tripling of plastic waste by 2050. So, subsuming EPR under plastic waste management is a misinterpretation of its potential beyond waste recovery. EPR is a scheme for producers to internalize all environmental and human health costs caused by their products. So, as we have shared, the Philippine EPR law would define the environmental policy approach and practice that requires producers to be environmentally responsible throughout the life cycle of the product. And also, we have also included in the law activities and strategies like adoption of reusable products or redesign of the products to improve reusability, the inclusion of recycled content, adoption of appropriate product refilling systems, viable reduction rate rates plans, and also information, education, and campaign. So the state of play on finances for implementation is also very important. That's why, as a member state, we support the establishment of a hybrid mechanism, which would include a dedicated fund within an existing financial arrangement for support of early action and implementation. Also, we support a comprehensive finance package that leverages all available resources, including public and private financing, and aligns financial flows with the treaty's objectives. And lastly, we would like to consider innovative financial mechanisms such as outcomes-based instruments as proposed by other member states, impact bonds, and plastic credit facilities. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And at this point in time, I would like to turn over the microphone, the floor to Alison Lin. She's from Mars Incorporated, representing the Business Coalition for a Global Plastics Treaty. Alison, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, Your Excellencies, delegates, and distinguished colleagues, and thank you for having me. My name is Alison Lin from Mars, and I'm also here representing the Business Coalition. And to start, I think there's a high level of convergence throughout the different presenters that have outlined what they want to see in a global treaty today. And there's a high level of convergence with what the Business Coalition is seeking within an ambitious and effective global treaty. So first, we think it's very important to have an internationally legally binding instrument that addresses the full life cycle of plastics, both the social and environmental impacts, starting with the production stage and going all the way down to waste management and legacy pollution, including mechanisms towards a just transition throughout the life cycle of plastics. We think that a voluntary and fragmented and non-specific approach of policies actually adds costs and barriers and uncertainty for business, which adds, again, costs and slows down the progress that we can make, especially if we want to do any of these things at scale. We recognize that with the limited time that we have in negotiations, we might not reach everything at INC 5, but we can start with some strong provisions and strengthen as we go along. So some of the strong provisions that we want to see include, first, the restriction and phase out of chemicals of concerns as well as problematic plastic products, and to improve product design. There's already a lot of voluntary initiatives to do this that we've proven, but to do this at scale, we really need some global harmonization around what are considered chemicals of concern, what are considered problematic and avoidable plastics, with transparency and reporting throughout the process, informed by clear criteria and possibly with some initial lists, so that we can understand where these chemicals exist and understand where we can phase them out of our products. Next, there's an obligation to introduce, we would like an obligation to introduce and advance targets and systems for collection, reuse, and recycling at the national level based on common definitions of extended producer responsibility, or EPR, as well as deposit return systems, DRS. So some things on EPR, it's already been mentioned today, but it has a proven track record of supporting designing for circularity, which will eliminate some of the chemicals of concerns and problematic materials that we spoke about, and drive higher collection and recycling systems. And it effectively funds the system with the fees being paid by the producers so that it continue to be self-sustained and funded throughout its life cycle. Businesses have recognized that this fee-based approach works and is necessary to address plastic pollution. We also know that not all EPR is created equal, so it's not binary, yes EPR, no EPR. There are more effective systems of EPR, and we do need to recognize where the starting point is for each of the nations that are implementing EPR. But we do think that there is a minimal level of harmonization that can be done that will benefit both large corporations as well as small SMEs and medium enterprises that do not have the resources and capacity to manage compliance risk all around the world. Having very disparate systems of EPR is very complicated and makes it very difficult for us to both comply and design our systems for our products for these EPR systems. So we would like harmonization, at least at some level within the treaty. And we support the establishment of EPR systems with annex on modalities to inform the establishment of EPR systems. And we need to define common principles and minimum requirements. Next, we think a comprehensive package needs to support we need a comprehensive package to support the implementation of a treaty, including aligning financial flows with the objectives of the treaty and mobilizing both public and private support to ensure a just transition towards a circular economy that is fair and inclusive to everyone, the workers, the enterprises, and communities, especially by creating decent work opportunities in the plastics value chain. We think that with the global treaty, with EPR systems, there will be investments, again, both with public and private sector support that will improve the economic situation, both globally and locally. We agree that we can't get everything at INC 5, so we do think that we need to develop further work on some of the priorities. Therefore, we've created a treaty on a page that'll drop in the chat later that looks at what we think we can adopt now and have a start and strengthen approach so that we can get to convergence at INC 5 and then continue to strengthen as we go along. And to do that, we think we need future decisions strengthened at a conference of parties or COPs, and that we need a mandate to develop sector-specific programs of work to inform the future decisions with specific implementation targeting plastic applications where there's sufficient alignment, such as packaging and fishing gear to start with. In summary, business wants global rules, and we think global rules are absolutely necessary to effectively harmonize regulations around the full life cycle of plastics, including reduction, circularity, and prevention and remediation, with a recognition of both the social and environmental impacts across the full life cycle. An ambitious and an effective global treaty is good for the environment, it's good for society, and it's good for business, and has the opportunity to create economic opportunities at both the global and local level, along with social and the environmental benefits that we've discussed today. Thank you for your time, and with that, I'll turn it over to Talash Kantai, who's the team leader and writer at IISD Earth Negotiations Bulletin. Over to you, Talash.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you also to all the speakers before me, and especially to Chair Vyas, who has really set us up to understand where we're heading in the for Inc. 5. While we were thinking about organizing this webinar, I think when we initially envisioned it, we were not very hopeful that this would be the last Inc. Before us at that point, we had a document that had 3,000 brackets in it, and it was overwhelming, thinking again that we only had 7 days, 63 hours left of formal negotiation time. So it's very heartening to hear that there is a new path forward, there is a new document coming forward that is more focused. I think that was what was missing in the previous document, just a stronger focus on what are the things that would need to be achieved by the end of the Inc. process. With that, again, thank you for everybody who's spoken before me. I have a privilege of coming quite far down the line, so I will be repeating some of the things, but I appreciate very much all of what has been said. I think looking at how to make this a strong treaty, how to make this an effective treaty to eliminate or to end plastic pollution, there are many things that are still outstanding, and I hope that the text that we will have before us for parties to negotiate, for member states to negotiate, will look at member states are going to need to come to the table and be ready to really address issues such as the scope. We know that, we have agreed that we're ending plastic pollution, but I guess the big question that has been raised also by other panelists is, where does plastic pollution start? We need to have a little bit of a focus on that. Does plastic pollution start at the pollution level? We've agreed that it doesn't start at waste management. How much higher up the hierarchy does it go? And then what measures in the treaty are going to be mandatory? What measures are going to be voluntary? Those are also going to be very important as we go forward. Those are issues that have become big sticking points that we're going to need to get over very, very quickly. Where we're looking at curbs or eliminating problematic plastic or chemicals of concern, how is this going to be implemented? How is this area going to be implemented? Will it be all at once by all the parties across the board, or will there be a staggered approach? These are some of the things that are going to be very important as we look towards a new treaty. But beyond that, I guess we have to also think about definitions. I think that we haven't had a clear discussion to this point on some of the broader definitions that will set us up on the right path. And I really hope that at Inc. 5 the states can really get into that discussion. What is plastic pollution? When we're talking about, okay, I guess during the intersessional period, we have had a bigger, broader discussion on chemicals of concern, and such definitions are going to be very important going forward. The treaty, I guess, and delegates will need to also figure out a way to ensure that the treaty produces measures for accountability for producers, for manufacturers of plastic and plastic products, and that this accountability is across the board, is global accountability. I think what we've seen is this dichotomy between measures that only work for certain countries, and especially countries in the developed world. Where I live, where I come from, there's hardly any accountability to plastic or from plastic producers, plastic manufacturers. And I think that this is going to need to happen in a global treaty. As previous speakers just talked about, EPR is also going to be very, very important, and also, again, has to be done at the global scale in a holistic manner. It cannot be that certain products or certain products in certain places, the same product in the global north has labeling standards, whereas in other places it doesn't. In the global south, there are no labeling standards, and there's no way of knowing whether this is recyclable, reusable, how that is done. And I guess looking ahead, perhaps even beyond Inc. 5, how can we make this treaty sticky? I look at the treaty as a puzzle piece, and a puzzle piece maybe can look good on its own, but without putting it in the context of the entire puzzle, the bigger picture, then it's kind of it's not as useful as it could be. And so how can we make it sticky? I think we've heard speakers, I think Dr. Kashashni spoke about how we need to involve other ministries. This needs to be an interministerial process. And so in that fact, how can we make sure that this treaty can be used and implemented by members of the WHO, because it is a health treaty, right? If it is affecting human health in all the ways that science keeps showing us, that the newest studies are there are microplastics in the human brain. That is something that needs to be considered. It is a health matter. It becomes a food security matter, because plastic and chemicals within plastics are leaking into our soils, into our rivers, and into our oceans, affecting the food we eat. So that becomes, a food security issue. It's we have to think about it as it concerns the Basel Convention in trade and waste, and this has been, of course, very, very hard for certain actors to talk about, because the developing world gets a lot of plastic waste from the developed world. How can we ensure that this treaty halts such practices? So the plastic waste is dealt with in a better manner, in a fairer manner. Also how it touches on the Stockholm Convention. There are also links to the ILO in terms of labor. How can we make sure that waste pickers have rights, and how are those rights going to be ensured by this treaty? How can the ILO sort of plug into this treaty to get some ideas? And then, of course, there are trade issues across the board, as we've heard. I think the thing about this treaty and all the work that has gone into it, all the years of discussing it and negotiating it, from what we've seen, it's like this is a standalone treaty, and we've sort of got to this point, and it was a big win to get to this point for this to be a standalone treaty. But if it acts in a standalone manner, it cannot be effective. There has to be incredible coordination, cooperation, and partnership with a range of existing MEAs and other agencies in order for it to be effective. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass the floor now to Caroline Deer-Birkbeck, who is the Executive Director of the Forum of Trade, Environment, and SDGs, Tess.
So thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to wrap up after this really great set of perspectives on where we need to advance in order to successfully conclude the treaty negotiations in December. So to wrap up, I'm going to go back to the beginning of this webinar. And we heard at the beginning from the chair that to achieve the ambition of having a robust and effective treaty by the end of the year, we need to focus our attention on the essential elements that are needed and fit for the purpose of ending plastic pollution. He also mentioned including what details and issues can be developed during the interim period after the diplomatic conference to help countries prepare for early and effective implementation of the instrument after entry into force. So we received some really clear guidance and direction from the chair at the outset. So as we embark on this final stage of negotiations, my reflection is that it's vital that we step back to ask ourselves 4 questions. The first is, where do our collective efforts need to focus in order to address the urgency, the scale, and the complexity of the plastic pollution challenge? The second is, what does this mean we must have in the treaty to drive the necessary changes and to catalyze international cooperation? And the third is, what is needed to ensure that we recognize and address wider socioeconomic considerations? And what do we need to ensure the effectiveness and progress of the treaty over time? So key to answering these questions is to remind ourselves, as our speakers have done today, is that we have no shortage of data and knowledge about the scale and impacts of plastic pollution across the life cycle. So it's worth just going back, without going into the details, what are some of the core points we've heard today. We have a range of different models and different data sets from a range of scientists that all converge on the point that without global intervention, plastic pollution caused by unsustainable levels of production, lack of global rules for products and chemicals in products, leakage, waste management, and lack of financial resources to deal with this crisis will all increase. And as they increase, they will exacerbate environmental and health impacts. We know more and more about the impacts of plastics on our health, including from the thousands of chemicals in plastics, many of which are known to be of concern. We know about the health impacts associated across the whole life cycle of plastic and that affect all of us, but particularly women, children, and people in communities in vulnerable situations, particularly in developing countries. We know from our daily experience that we all interact with many plastic products that are harmful to the environment and to human health. And we also all know that we interact every day with a broad range of unnecessary products. We know that the fate of millions of tons of plastic waste every year is to be mismanaged with practices that are not safe or environmentally sound. We know that millions more leak into the environment. We know that underlying all of this, we have too much cheap plastic. We know that current levels of primary plastic production and the trajectory we are on is unsustainable. It exceeds capacities for waste management and recycling, and it undermines the efforts by countries to tackle plastic pollution. We also know that the scale of plastic production currently, let alone its expansion, will impact our ability to stay below the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree temperature goal. UN Secretary General said on World Environment Day last year, plastic is made of fossil fuels. The more plastic we make, the more fossil fuel we burn, and the worse we make the climate crisis. It's pretty clear. In short, we know that addressing the supply of primary plastic polymers, achieving sustainable levels of production and consumption is key if we're to truly tackle the plastic pollution crisis. So what's clear is that we can't continue business as usual. And I think the speakers today have really clearly underlined that. But the existing data and knowledge and the remarks today also provide us some very clear messages on what we need in the treaty. And many of the speakers have already spoken on many specific aspects, so I won't repeat those. I'm just trying to mention here a couple of cross-cutting issues that I heard today. First is that it's essential to ensure the full life cycle is addressed in the treaty, with provisions in the text that address all key areas. And 2 years ago, members agreed to do just this, to take a comprehensive approach that addresses the full life cycle of plastic. The second is that an effective treaty will require a global approach and global rules. We know already that many countries are taking action nationally, and companies are taking action to address the challenges. But we know that there is no single country or policy response or company action that in isolation can address the scale and complexity of these issues. That's why we're negotiating for a treaty. We know that a mixture of uncoordinated national initiatives won't cope with a problem that's transboundary by nature because of the pollution that travels across boundaries and borders, and because of the reality that trade, investment, and supply chains underpin the global plastics economy. So fragmented patchwork of national efforts is ineffective, it's expensive, it generates a range of tensions and uncertainties, and it undermines the speed, scale, and effectiveness of change that we need to see. As the business leaders representative has said here today, businesses are telling us also that they need global rules to underpin globally coordinated action. So third, as several of our speakers also noted, we can do this. We can approach global rules in ways that also account for national circumstances. We've done this before in international treaties. The evidence and the speakers today have emphasized the need for a treaty that recognizes and takes into account national circumstances and socioeconomic constraints, sustainable development priorities, and transition needs. So there's awareness that we need to do this, and we can find ways to do so. Fourth, and related to that point, is most of our speakers, actually all of our speakers today, have underlined the significant and broad array of needs for financing, technology, capacity building, and technical assistance. They've underlined that the success of the treaty will depend upon ensuring ambitious cooperation, financing, and support for implementation. So on the financing front, we know that in order to be effective, we'll need a holistic approach. We'll need to align both public and private financing with the treaty's goals. We'll need to harness a range of potential sources of financing to support interventions across the life cycle. We'll need a strong and effective financial mechanism underpinned by overseas development assistance. But in addition to these traditional sources and approaches to intergovernmental cooperation, there is a range of additional sources, including private sector contributions. And in this regard, speakers on the panel have highlighted the need to consider the role that fees on producers along the value chain can play as a source of financing, as well as blended finance and public-private partnerships that can de-risk and mobilize investment. A number of speakers also highlighted the significant economic upsides and opportunities that can arise from implementing new global common rules. So the heard from speakers that's the importance of starting strong and ensuring that there are mechanisms for strengthening the treaty. And finally, we've heard this appeal for a clear objective, that the objective should be to end plastic pollution in order to protect human health and the environment. If we have a clear objective, that can help guide implementation, assessment, and adjustment of the treaty over time, including in response to emerging knowledge. Such a shared common objective can also anchor and guide consideration of all of the core obligations and how these should be crafted to achieve this objective, and can also help guide on what kinds of means of implementation are required to support the achievement of that objective. So to close, to conclude an effective treaty fit for the purpose of ending plastic pollution at INC 5, we'll need to discuss with integrity, grounded in the scientific evidence and facts before us on the scale and many dimensions of the plastics crisis, on its urgency and what it will take to address it, as well as of the social and economic opportunities and challenges at hand. We'll also need to bear in mind the issue of urgency. The mandate is to conclude a treaty by the end of 2024. But the urgency is also because of the real human health and environmental impacts and the challenges that the pollution is presenting now, every day, to millions of people around the world, and the economic and commercial decisions that companies and governments will make now that will either lock in or enable us and catalyze the transformation we need to see. We need to get started now. In good news, the chair has guided members towards focusing on essential elements and what we need to see in the initial treaty text in early December that will set us up to effectively and efficiently and fairly address plastic pollution to protect health and the environment. He's also guiding members to focus on what can be done to help countries to prepare for early and effective implementation of the instrument. In this regard, and as many of you have noted, it will be really important that we ensure that we leave INC5 with a clear mandate for work in the interim period and clear hooks in the treaty for how follow-up work will be conducted. So the renewed and sharpened focus on what is essential for the treaty is key to fulfilling the task of ending plastic pollution, and it's bringing new momentum and a new emphasis on seeking convergence. So now is not the time for losing ambition, but it is a time to seize the opportunity to focus on the core obligations and provisions we need to see in the treaty that will establish strong foundations and that can be built over time. So with my very best successes, very best wishes for our collective success and all the success of all of the negotiators, I pass the baton over to all of you as delegates and observers and attendees and campaigners on the Plastic Pollution Treaty for a successful outcome in Busan. And then back to you, Diana.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for closing our line of speakers. Thank you to all our attendees to have joined us today to explore what to expect on the remaining road to INC5 and in Busan. A few resources have been shared in the chat as we were running the event. Those will also be available on the webpage of the event that it was mentioning at the beginning of this event. Particularly a warm thanks to the chair, Ambassador Vallas, to have opened the line today, to all the leading experts that join the line of speakers, and to those who have worked behind the scenes to organize the dialogue we had today. And a few more that are to come, because indeed we have already a few sessions of the Geneva Big Plastic Pollution Dialogues already confirmed, and a few more that are cooking. On 16th of October, we are joining forces with IUCN to discuss the reinforcement of commitments to nature and communities. And on the 30th of October, we are hosting the launch of the Champions of Change Coalition with the Greenpeace. There are a few more events that you can see here on the screen that are announced that can also be of interest for this community. And as we close this event, I would like to wish the chair and the delegates on behalf here of the organizers a successful intersessional work in the road to Busan and to find convergences to deliver on the ambition of the treaty. So thank you all for having joined us today and looking forward to welcome you at one of our upcoming sessions. And Ambassador Vallas, very best wishes for the important work that you are doing.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.